I want to begin by thanking you for the invitation to be with you this week in your Adult Bible School series. When I heard from Jim, first of all, it was a bit of a surprise. It's been years since I have known him. He was a student when I was a professor at Gordon Conwell. We really got to know each other, not in the classroom, but on the softball field. Jim was a shortstop. I was the first baseman. We played for the Tasmanian Devils. Yes. We lost most of the games, but Jim and I had great fun, and we got to know each other then. When he invited me to be part of this, I was delighted to do so. Now this morning, I want to talk about noticing God, the spiritual discipline of noticing God. And I want to do this in the context of the Great Commandment, the gospel passage that I just read to you. The Great Commandment, as you know, says that love is to have three directions. We are meant to love God in a wholehearted way, we're to love others, and we are to love ourselves properly. And I want to focus on the first part of the commandment, loving God, which is foundational to loving others and loving ourselves. And here is my thesis. How are we to love God in this wholehearted way if God is mostly a proposition to us, ideas that we believe about God, and not a person that we encounter in our daily lives? You know, God is not hidden. God is present and active in this world. God is as present as our next breath, but mostly we don't notice God's presence. So the challenge to us is to notice God, and so to love the God who is real and present. Let's pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. First of all, let's examine the passage from Mark's Gospel. Jesus is in conversation with a scribe who asks a genuine question. Now, the context of this conversation between Jesus and the scribe is important. So let me describe the events leading up to this particular conversation. All this takes place in the last week of Jesus' life. Now, as you know, Jesus has come up to Jerusalem in an atmosphere of great excitement, with crowds cheering, with branches spread along the way during his triumphal entry. But this rejoicing is followed the next day by conflict and controversy as Jesus cleanses the temple of the merchants who have made this house of prayer into a raucous Oriental bazaar. By doing so, Jesus directly challenges the religious power structures of the time. You see, it was the family of the high priest who were the dove sellers and money changers that Jesus drove out of the temple. And not surprisingly, the leaders see this as a threat. They challenge his right to cleanse the temple. Who gave you the authority to do this, they ask. Now, Jesus doesn't answer this question directly. Rather, he tells a parable. The parable of the wicked tenants. You remember that. They killed the vineyard owner's son. And these leaders knew he was telling the parable against them. And so it went the last week of his life. Attack, counterattack. And suddenly, in the midst of all this controversy, our thoughtful scribe appears on the scene, asking a genuine question about the greatest commandment. And the whole tone changes, and the controversy subsides. So let's move from context to the conversation itself. First of all, you need to know something about this scribe who asked such a penetrating question. Scribes, as you know, were the first century equivalent of religious lawyers. Now, when you live in a law-based theocracy, as Israel was at that time, you need experts to sort out the commandments for you in all their detail. Now, in Jesus' days, there were two schools of thought about Jewish law. One camp of scribes and teachers had as their agenda the expansion of the law so that it covered every conceivable situation. So, for example, it's the Sabbath. and your lamb, who is always getting out of the pen, falls into this pit and has a gash on his leg. So the question is this. It's the Sabbath. You're not allowed to do any work. Can you lift the lamb out of the pit? Can you bandage the wound on its leg? Well, the scribes thought about this and said, well, you can bandage the wound on his leg, but you can't put any healing salve on the wound, because that would promote healing, and healing is work, and you can't do that on the Sabbath. So, over time, the 10 Commandments morph into over 60 volumes of regulations. This was the expansionist agenda. Now, the other camp of scribes, of which our scribe was part, sought the reverse, to reduce the law to its essence, like the famous Rabbi Hillel, who was asked by his proselyte to tell him the whole law while standing on one leg. All right, now get that image in your mind and imagine a sermon being preached to you while standing on one leg. Okay, it'd be a short sermon. This was the reductionist agenda, and Hillel was well up to this particular challenge. What he said was this: what you yourselves hate, do not do to your neighbor. This is the whole law, the rest is commentary. Now our scribe wants to know, can Jesus do this? Can he reduce the law to its essence? And Jesus, of course, is also up to this challenge. And what he does is to combine two Old Testament texts in a whole new way. He begins with the famous Shema taken from Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This ringing endorsement of monotheism, which was used as a daily prayer by pious Jews, which is followed by Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Jesus quotes that. He adds the phrase, and with all your mind. In other words, we are called to an all-encompassing love of the one God. Then to this passage from Deuteronomy, Jesus adds Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And in this way, he defines the essence of the law as a threefold love: loving God, loving your neighbor, loving yourself. And here's where this whole thing of noticing God comes in. Quite simply, we cannot love God in this all-encompassing way unless God is on our personal radar, unless God is alive and present for us, unless God is more than a word for us. So the question is, how is God present for us and to us? Where and how do we encounter the living presence of God in this world? To try and answer this question, I want to identify various ways in which men and women down through history have met God, and in this way we become more alert to the presence of God in our world and in our lives. First of all, we meet God via mystical experiences. Sometimes God just bursts into our presence without warning, like what happened to Paul on the road to Damascus. The last thing in the world he wanted when he was on his way to Damascus to sniff out the Christians and put them in jail. Last thing he wanted was a mystical experience of Jesus. But that's exactly what happened, and his whole life turned around. Now, such mystical experiences are more common than we realize. A study done by Andrew Greeley in the mid-70s for the University of Chicago discerned that about 35% of adult Americans have had a classic mystical experience. Now, more recent research indicates that number is probably about 50%, which means a lot of us have had this kind of experience. But what is a mystical experience? Well, it's what happened to my friend David, who was a professor at a college in Boston, a scientist. He went to check out a church when his children became old enough to need what he called a moral education. And the youth pastor said, "You're in luck. We have a special youth service this Saturday. Come and hang out, see what this church is all about." And David did that. He sat in the back of the auditorium, and in the middle of the service it happened. He was overwhelmed by the presence of God, and it shook him to his very core. We met David when he came to our weekly Bible study. He was there because he was trying to make sense out of what had happened to him. And he said, "No one could ever have convinced me that there was a God. I was a thoroughgoing materialist, but God bypassed all my arguments and revealed himself to me in a way that I cannot deny." This is what a mystical experience is. But the thing about mystical experiences is they're rare, they can't be planned, they just happened. And so we can't build our spiritual life around such singular events. We need to meet God in ordinary life and take such experiences as a gift from God. And so the second thing that I want to talk about is meeting God in the ordinary. And here is where Ignatian spirituality has been very helpful to me. St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, believed that God is in everything, and the challenge is to notice God's presence. So Ignatius, the community of Jesus, developed ways of prayer to help us notice God in daily life. So, for example, there is something called the prayer of examen, which Ignatius urged all members of his order to engage in on a daily basis. This is a three-part prayer. It begins by reflecting on the previous 24 hours. It's 10 a.m. Sunday morning. Where were you at 10 a.m. Saturday morning? And then begin to go back through this period of time. And first of all, look for all the blessings that God has given you in this period of time. And thank God for these. Then do this once again. Go back and look at that same 24-hour period of time, but this time watch for where God has been present to you and for you, and reflect on that presence of God. And then do this one last time, a third time. Go back over this 24-hour period of time and watch for where you've said no to God and ask for God's forgiveness. And you see how when you do this on a regular basis, you begin to notice God in the fabric of your everyday life. Now, I'm going to go into more detail about the prayer of examen and other forms of Ignatian prayer on Tuesday night when I talk about Ignatius as one of our exemplars of the faith. Third, we meet God in the Bible. The Bible is a record of God's interaction with our planet and with the people on it. The Bible is also the revelation of who God is and how we can meet and know God. And now you know this, you're Presbyterians, okay? You also know that it's not just a matter of reading about God in the Bible. There are also those special times when we meet God in the Bible, when the Bible comes alive for us, as it were. Barbara Bradley Haggerty, the NPR religion reporter for many years, wrote in her book Fingerprints of God about her experiences of reading the Gospels following a mystical experience she had. She writes this: "The Gospels, which tell of the kindness and boldness and humanness of Jesus, reached up and grabbed me, demanded that I pay attention. The words of Matthew, the tax collector, Mark, the itinerant, Luke, the doctor, and John, the fisherman, hijacked my senses. I heard the voice of Jesus saying to the prostitute, 'Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more.' I heard it as if he had uttered those very words to me. I tasted the salty air of the Galilean Sea and smelled the fear of the fishermen caught in a vicious squall. When Jesus touched the desperate leper, I recoiled from the brackish wounds. The 2,000-year-old story sprang up like those pop-up birthday cards from 2 dimensions to 3, from myth to concrete reality." And she ends by saying, "What unnerved me was the feeling seemed to come from outside me, not within. It was as if someone had tied a rope around my waist and pulled me slowly with infinite determination towards a door that was ajar. And so she was converted. So we read the Bible to know about God, even as we read the Bible to meet God, and I expect that has happened to you. Fourth, we meet God in other people. It's this Matthew 25 thing where Jesus talks about the end time and the judgment and says, "Then the king will say to those at the right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison when you visited me.' And the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.' A cup of cold water given to those in need." The religious order of the Benedictines take this passage quite literally. They believe that we can meet God in the stranger, in the other who is in need, in each other. And so they structure their monasteries around hospitality, around welcoming the stranger and being open to the other. I'm going to talk about Benedict on Thursday night. But the question is this: how is God revealed in community and in others? Well, I think in several ways. I believe we encounter the Spirit of God when we experience the fruits of the Spirit in our relational encounter with others, where there is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. There is, in some sense, the Spirit of God. I also believe that we encounter God when we use our spiritual gifts, or when we encounter the presence of spiritual gifts in others. This is why it's so important to be active members of a community of faith such as this, because God is present here. We just have to be open. God is present in our worship, in our fellowship. God is present here and now in this place amongst us. And then fifth, we meet God in nature. God is, after all, the creator, and God's footprints are all over this planet. The challenge is discerning these. I like what Laird Hamilton says about seeing God in nature. Now Hamilton is not noted as a Christian spokesman. Rather, he's one of the world's greatest big wave surfers. I like quoting a surfer. And these are really big waves. 50 feet is the smallest, over 100 feet. And Hamilton says, if you can look at one of these waves and you don't believe that there's something greater than we are, then you've got some serious analyzing to do, and you should just go out and sit under a tree for a very long time. Power, beauty, intricacy, elegance, order in creation can evoke in us strong reactions: awe and wonder, delight, longing, deep stillness, even reverence. And it's a short step from awe in response to creation to an even deeper awe for the Creator. And we also discover God in the greatest of God's creations, human beings. And maybe particularly in the artistic creations of human beings. We're made in the image of God. We bear the marks of God on us, and one of which is the ability to create. The creative process itself transcends time, often touches other realities, reflects transcendence. And so this is why we're moved by great music and magnificent art and soaring buildings. This is why God can speak to us through film and through literature and pop culture in general. These are all marks of the Creator. Finally, I want to say just a word about the still small voice of God, the inner voice which Elijah experienced in 1 Kings 19 as he sat under that broom tree. Does God actually talk to us? Okay, now I have to confess a bias here. I get worried by folk who claim to have a running, ongoing conversation with God. Okay. I wonder about that. My experience is that God is not a chatty God, overwhelming us with details about how we ought to live our daily life. But I do believe and have experienced what I know to be the voice of God on certain occasions. And of course, once we posit that God can and does speak to us, we've got another problem. How do we know it's God? There are lots of voices in our heads, voices of our culture, of our needs and our wishes and our desires, the voice of our mother. We never lose the voice of our mother over time, reminding us to do this and do that. The attribution is the problem, claiming that it's God when it's not. A lot of crazy things have been done in the name of God. For discernment, that's what we need. Discernment is the answer, knowing that it is God. And for discernment, we need others who know us well. We need a deep knowledge of Scripture. We need experienced guides. And in particular, we need a good dose of humility. So we encounter myriad intimations of transcendence of God in our daily lives if we take the time and give the attention needed to be present to God. Noticing God enables us to be present to God, to worship God, to pray to God, to listen to God, to follow God's way. And in noticing God, God moves from the periphery of our lives to the center of our lives. And so we're able to love God in this all-encompassing way. Love God with your heart, with your mind, with your soul, with your strengths. This is the great commandment. And may it be so for each of us as we walk in this pilgrimage of faith. Let me end by reading what the great mystic Thomas Merton said in a seminar towards the end of his life. It captures well what I'm trying to say. Merton said this: life is this simple. We're living in a world that is absolutely transparent, and God is shining through it all the time. This is not just a fable or nice story. It is true. If we abandon ourselves to God and forget ourselves, we see it sometimes, and we see it maybe frequently. God manifests himself everywhere, in everything, in people and in things and in nature and in events. It becomes very obvious that he is everywhere and in everything, and we cannot be without him. You cannot be without God. It's impossible. It's simply impossible.